Hey there, we're going to talk a little bit about the Great Lakes, and the primary question that we're going to be exploring is how can people best use and protect Earth's freshwater resources? Because remember that freshwater is what we depend on as humans for survival. The ways that humans have been impacting the environment in the Great Lakes region were those five areas that were in the graphic organizer at the beginning of the chapter. And then remember from our quiz that 90% of North America's fresh water does come from the Great Lakes. So this particular region is especially important to those of us living in Canada and the United States. A little bit of background information. Remember that the vocabulary is especially important, and so for your geoterms assignment, the terms that you were exploring are ecosystem, and remember that an ecosystem is the connection of all living things in an area. That includes the plants and includes the animals, and remember that humans are an animal species. Then also remember that you interact with your environment, and that plants and animals can survive in a particular environment because of the climate, the seasons that impact the vegetation that's a source of food, which then leads us to our next term, which is a series of terms, a food chain and a food web. And a food chain is the series of plants and animals that depend upon each other for an energy source. So plants that provide energy for animals that eat those plants, smaller animals which provide energy for larger animals, and then larger animals on up the food chain. You can also say that everyone depends upon the sun for food, because the sun is what creates the food source in the plants, and then the plants become the food source and on up the food chain. Now, multiple food chains together can create a food web, because as we know, most species depend on multiple food sources for a reason, because if all of your food source comes from one area and then there's a drought or there's some negative impact on that food source, then you can't survive anymore. And so most plants and animals have adapted to need multiple areas or get their food source from multiple areas. But also remember that each chain is connected, so if one particular species dies off or is impacted, then that has ripple effect out from that part of the chain. Freshwater. The reason that we're focusing on the Great Lakes is because there's a differentiation between freshwater and saltwater, which is typically oceans and seas, and you're going to get different types of creatures that can survive in a freshwater environment as opposed to a saltwater environment. A watershed is also called a drainage basin, and this is the geographic area. It includes the land and the water. We realize that water flows from rivers into lakes or into other rivers, but also remember that land connects the water system as well, and that as rain drains into the ground, it also follows gravity to the lowest point and then becomes a part of the water system as well. So land and water together create that drainage basin. And remember, I always use the memory trick of thinking about a bowl, and that in a bowl the liquid is going to go to the bottom. It's going to follow gravity and collect in the lowest possible point. Pollution. There are two different terms that the chapter is going to refer to: point source pollution and non-point source pollution. The easiest way to remember them is to think, can I point to the source of the pollution? If there's a big factory and there's smokestacks with lots of smoke coming out, I could point to that smokestack and say, that's where the pollution's coming from. Or a pipe that's going into the lake and leaking lots of green toxic sludge, I can point to that pipe and say, that's where the pollution is coming from. Non-point source pollution is a mix of sources. When acid rain comes down from the sky, it could be coming from your cars, it could be coming from a factory, and so we can't point to the rain and say, well, where did you come from? Because it's coming from multiple sources. The same thing when something called runoff occurs, and there could be multiple farms, multiple factories, and as the chemicals or pollutants seep into the ground source, and that seeps into the water source through drainage, you can't tell where it's coming from. It's just occurring in, you can measure it in the water source itself. So that's the primary difference between point source pollution and non-point source pollution. Invasive species are any plant or animal, and remember that plants can also be invasive, that it's any living species. It doesn't naturally occur there, and they're going to impact the environment in ways that natural plants or native species, as we would refer to them, don't do, because they've adapted to that environment. Invasive species come in with a different set of adaptations that don't always match the new environment. Habitat loss is the alteration or destruction of the home or food source or water source for a plant or animal species. And if they can't survive there anymore because either their home has been damaged, their food source is gone, or their water source is damaged or gone, then obviously that species can't survive there, so they either die off or migrate to another area. With those terminology and with those vocabulary terms, we want to set the stage for where the Great Lakes were in 1969. The Great Lakes was just one example. The pollutants and invasive species and habitat loss were happening in other parts of the United States. But in 1969, specifically, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught fire, and that was caused by all of the toxic chemicals, the trash that had just been dropped into the lake and into the river, and created this immediate awareness. A fire on a river, pretty big signal that something's not right. But there was also out of control algae, and algae were those green thick mats we saw in the news article where ducks can't swim, fish can't swim. It also actually blocks the sunlight that can get to plants and animals that are swimming beneath the surface as well, so it has a lot of negative impact. DDT, and there are a lot of chemicals that were being sprayed to control insects, to promote plant growth, was then leaching into the soil and then therefore entering the water system that way. And then also those invasive species, which began even as far back as 1829, when some of those first canals were built to connect the Great Lakes. A species that originally couldn't get out of one of the lakes, now there's a waterway and a passage that allows them to spread to an area that they're not usually in. So the question that was asked in that news article was, can the lakes be saved? Have we destroyed so much of the habitat or created such an industrial cesspool, as they phrased it, that these are just going to become lifeless swamps? This is also about the time that in the United States there was a lot of interest in environmental awareness, and Rachel Carson was an author who wrote a book called The Silent Spring, which created such an amount of interest and urgency that then Congress passed laws to actually start to protect and preserve our clean air and water. We're going to take a break and come back and review the three main topics from Chapter 4, pollution, invasive species, and habitat loss.